A few years back, I reviewed the AOC Q24G2A, a rather unique monitor because of its 23.8-inch form factor, IPS panel with a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate that went up to 165Hz. Step forward its successor, the AOC Q24G4RE. This monitor now has a refresh rate that goes up to 180Hz, but is otherwise pretty much near on identical. It has support for adaptive sync technologies and HDR, but get this, at the time of filming and in the UK can be found for just £110, which on paper makes it a really tempting proposition. Now this monitor is not to be confused with another one that I recently reviewed, and that's the AOC Q24G4SR. This monitor has got a 1440p resolution, but a refresh rate of 300Hz and a form factor that's slightly larger at 24.5 inch. If you do want to check out that review, make sure you check out the links down in the description below. Speaking of which, down there you'll find the monitor that can be found on Amazon, and the same can be achieved if you scan the QR code that can be found on your screen. This will take you to your localized Amazon store where you'll hopefully find the cheapest price for it. Now in this review you can see if the G4RE is worth its price tag, how it compares to its predecessor, and also its modern sibling. So to kick things off, I would like to point out that if you do want to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution, you have to be connected up to the singular DisplayPort 1.4 input. I say this because if you're going to be using the singular HDMI 2.0 port instead, you'll be capped at 144Hz at 1440p. Of course, it should be a non-issue if you're going to be dropping down the resolution. Now with that out of the way, let's get on to the monitor's input lag. And subjectively, I'll say it actually did a tremendous job. I had no issues whatsoever while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2. The mouse input responded instantaneously on the monitor itself. And this is thanks to the fact that the monitor has got a low input lag mode which can be enabled or disabled via the monitor's OSD. No real idea why you'd ever want to disable said option, but it might become grayed out in certain scenarios. Nonetheless, the monitor's input lag is very good, and therefore, as a hardcore gamer myself, I do find it actually really good. Now, in terms of the overall response time of the monitor, this is also very important. Here you've got a few different overdrive modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. You've got off, fast, faster, and fastest. Now, as you go up the scale, you'll effectively get a faster response time of the monitor, and on the downside, you'll get some inverse ghosting, which might throw off your shots. Now for me to demonstrate it, I'm using the OSRTD tool, and as we ignore the off and the fast mode presets and start off at the faster mode preset, you'll be able to see that the average initial time sits at 5.62 milliseconds, which is perfectly respectable. However, the percent in window is just 57%. In other words, the monitor is not really hitting that claimed 180Hz refresh rate window, and as a result means that it's not actually keeping up with that refresh rate that it should do. And as a result, the overall motion clarity won't be as you might expect. Now this thankfully improves in the fastest mode overdrive, but before transitioning I just want to draw your eyes towards the middle of your screen where you see the RGB overshoot, and on the faster mode preset there is no error whatsoever. However, as you'll be able to see now on the fastest mode preset, there is a lot more error, and I'll show the visual impact very shortly. But before doing so, you'll be able to see that the average initial time sits at a pretty low 3.34 milliseconds, and the percent in window drastically improves to 83%. Therefore, meaning that this monitor is actually keeping up with that 180Hz refresh rate window, and as such is what I would actually recommend if you want the best out of the monitor. Of course, the caveat is the overall inverse ghosting. Here you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test, and in comparison to the faster mode preset, the fastest mode does indeed have a little bit of that extra sort of haze that you'll be able to see behind the UFO. Now this didn't throw me off in a game such as Counter-Strike 2, and therefore I was very much pleasantly surprised that I was able to still use the monitor and therefore get the fastest response time of the monitor. However, in a lot more graphically intense games, the overall inverse ghosting does become a bit more noticeable, and as a result you might want to indeed dial it down to its faster mode preset. As you might be aware, this is going to impact the overall response time of the monitor, but hopefully that won't be your utmost priority if you're going to be playing non-hardcore shooters. Now through the UFO ghosting test you might have noticed that there was an extreme mode preset. And this is actually linked with the MBR settings, motion blur reduction. See, extreme is effectively replicating the fastest mode overdrive with the maximum MBR. If, however, you want some control over this, I'll suggest going on the fast or the faster mode preset and then adjusting with the MBR levels where you've got 20 different increments to choose from. This will effectively give you far better motion clarity, which you are hopefully able to see via the UFO ghosting test, therefore making it quite handy for hardcore gamers alike. Now, MBR can also be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, thanks to MBR Sync. It is sometimes a little bit of a faff to try and enable because for some reason the option seems to be grayed out and then suddenly pops up while nothing's actually been changing on the monitor. But with my setup, while running it over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080 and running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, I had no sort of black screen issues or flickering that I was able to notice, at least with my own eyes, and bear in mind the camera might pick this up, when I was having all these technologies running in tandem. Now furthermore, if you're not going to be using MBR Sync or indeed want HDR to be operating, then you can do so. It's going to be one or the other. The monitor does support an HDR signal and it's nothing really to overly shout about. It does a decent job when it comes to the overall color reproduction, and you've got a few different HDR modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. Suffice to say, it will accept the HDR signal, but it's not something that I would actually overly use given the fact that your brightness controls will be locked. And as a result of this, you might want to run the SDR image instead and therefore have full control over all the settings that you'll be able to achieve via the monitor's OSD. Speaking of which, if you're going to be hooking this up with a modern day console, you should be able to achieve 1440p at 120Hz. I did also notice that it accepted a 4K signal, which therefore might be handy for more legacy devices out there that want to feed through a 4K signal and effectively downscale it to 1440p. Now before moving on from the gaming section, I did promise that I would talk about its sibling and also its predecessor. First off, concentrating on what you can currently find right now, in other words the 300Hz monitor, the G4SR, I do think that the G4RE does offer a nice sort of alternative. Yes, indeed, it's not going to achieve the same sort of refresh rate and it has got a slightly smaller form factor, but otherwise does tick a lot of boxes. It's worth considering over here that it is pretty much half its price, which does seem pretty crazy to say because still at £200, the G4SR is an absolute no-brainer and is something I would highly recommend to a lot of gamers. But of course, if you're a bit more on a tighter budget and you want a smaller form factor 1440p monitor, then this might be definitely worth looking into. Now for those of you that own the G2A, in other words its predecessor, I just don't think it's worth selling it. In fact, definitely hold on to it because I do think you're holding on to a good sort of asset. I say this because that monitor has got a flexible stand, it's got better sort of overdrive modes which do actually do better in terms of if you're going to be dialing it down, and in terms of the overall color accuracy and the other features that it offers, well, it's pretty much near on identical. In other words, if you have the G2A, definitely don't sell it for the G4RE, but potentially consider upgrading to the G4SR instead. Hopefully that helps, but if you've got any questions, definitely do ask me down in the comment section below. Now it is a shame that this monitor does not have full brightness controls in HDR. However, you will find said controls if you're going to be enabling the sRGB mode, and this is when it comes to the overall color accuracy. As a reminder, the monitor has got a flat, matte-coated 23.8-inch IPS panel that runs a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate that goes up to 180Hz. Now, using the sRGB emulation mode, I was able to notice a gamma coverage of 96.8% and a gamma volume of 102.2%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average delta E sits at a stonkingly low 0.59 with a maximum sitting at 4.13, although here I do suspect it's because of my calibrator. Nonetheless, over here it can be used for serious image editing work or video grading. Its testosterone contrast ratio clocked in at a pretty impressive 1366 to 1, and in terms of its measured white point, in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target, it sat at 6161 Kelvin at 100%. And in terms of its overall gamma curve, it actually sits pretty much bang on to the 2.2 standard, which is very impressive. Now, if you're not going to be editing in the sRGB color space, I would highly suggest running the panel native mode. This will unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor, therefore giving you a little bit extra vibrancy, which can be handy, for example, if you're watching movies or indeed gaming. Now, aside from color test, in terms of brightness, I recorded a peak in HDR or SDR of 369 nits. It also has got a good level of range going all the way down to 41 nits. In other words, this monitor can be used in a bright sunlit room and also a pitch black environment without causing too much eye strain. In terms of the MBR 20 or the extreme level brightness, it sits at 92 nits. Indeed, this is going to be locked, but as I did mention, if you do want to adjust the MBR levels, then you can increase the overall brightness as you go down the scale. For example, MBR 1 will be much brighter than MBR 5, and that will indeed be a lot brighter than the likes of MBR 20. On the subject of peak luminance, it brings me on to brightness uniformity, and here you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board. Of course, yours might differ from mine because it is really panel lottery. It's not all that good towards the edges. As for the overall backlight bleed, I did find it perfectly acceptable, but some people are susceptible to such sort of phenomenon, and as a result, if that's going to be a real deal breaker for you, then you might want to look at a VA, TN, or if you can afford it, an OLED monitor instead. Moving swiftly on, we get onto build quality, and here it's good to see that the manufacturer has kind of ditched that sort of red accent design and given you a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. The stand itself is also pretty slender, therefore it should fit on most sort of desktop setups. However, it is a shame that it's actually fixed. You've only got the tilting function. Indeed, the height, the swivel, the pivot are all taken all together. And as a result of this, it means that if you do want a better sort of ergonomic feel, you might want to replace the built-in stand with a VESA-compatible one. Quite a shame that the manufacturer had ditched the stand that was present on the G2A, because that did give you all the right ergonomic controls that you might have desired. With that said, in comparison to its predecessor, it's great to see that the small physical buttons at the bottom right-hand side of the monitor have actually been updated, therefore making them very easy to press. And the OSD menu itself has also been spruced up. It looks far more appealing and is also comprehensively laid out, allowing you to tinker around with the right settings for you. Now, through the settings menu, you might have clocked in a volume tab, but this monitor does not have any sort of built-in speakers. Instead, you've got a 3.5mm jack, which can be found at the back of the monitor, and this is useful for you to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor, and therefore will be able to route audio directly through the HDMI or the DisplayPort inputs. So with all that in mind, can I see myself recommending the AOC Q24G4RE? Well, in a nutshell, absolutely, especially if you can find it at a cheaper price point of £110. It's pretty much an absolute no-brainer, at least if you're looking for a smaller form factor monitor that has got a pretty impressive refresh rate and also gaming performance. Sure enough, it's not quite perfect. I would have loved better sort of HDR capabilities, a more ergonomic stand, and also in terms of the faster mode preset to be a little bit better tuned, in that it could have provided you a little better sort of response time and also a percent in window. But still, for hardcore gamers out there, I think you'll actually be left pretty impressed when it comes to its maximum overdrive setting. And as a result of this, I can definitely see myself recommending it, and as such, it gets my Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and if you'd pick it over some rival alternatives. If you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification. All of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.